Forces, which include technologies, change that makes significant differences in people's lives. Discovery, these are discoveries of previously unknown or unrecognized things. Invention, reshaping existing cultural items into a new form. Immigration, and diffusion, diffusion meaning the transmission of cultural items or social practices between groups. These all work to produce cultural change and cultural diversity. This week, we're going to look at cultural change, cultural diversity, culture shock, ethnocentrism, and cultural relativism, and we'll look at the theoretical perspectives and views on culture. Alrighty, let's get going. Societies continually experience cultural change at both the material level and the non-material levels. Changes in technology continue to shape material culture in society. Some definitions that we're going to be considering that influence cultural change, well, we'll start with discovery. Something previously unknown or unrecognized. This is not as frequent as the next two definitions. Invention is reshaping existing items into new forms of cultural items. And then diffusion is transmission of cultural items or social practices from one culture to the next. And see the examples that I've shown in the background there. Now, all parts of culture do not change at the same pace. Cultural lag, now William Ogburn, he coined the term as this gap between technological development of a society, material culture, and its moral and legal institutions, the non-material culture. Cultural diversity refers to the wide range of cultural differences that are found between and within nations. So some terms to be aware of: homogeneous cultural condition is one language, one ethnicity, religion, and the things like that. Now, Sweden is a good example of what is a homogeneous nation. But when you think in terms of Canada, the term that's more appropriate is what's known as a heterogeneous society, where cultural diversity is inevitable, and Canada has always been characterized by at least three major cultures. Now, it's not limited to that, of course. There's many languages in a heterogeneous society. There's many ethnic groups, many religions. And in Canada, over the past 150 years, 13 million people have come to Canada from other areas. So if we carry on with this, in your textbook you'll find these maps. And it just looks at the fairly recent data from 2013, looking at religious affiliations and ethnic backgrounds of people living in Canada. And you'll find that in your textbook, just to sort of reinforce the degree of heterogeneousness there is in Canada. Now, some other terms to fit in cultural diversity, one of which is known as subcultures. Now, subcultures are groups of people who share a distinctive set of cultural beliefs and behaviors that differ in some significant way from the larger society. Now, an example of this are the Hutterites. They keep their culture while adapting to the technology of modern agriculture. Other Canadian examples would be Muslims, Italian Canadians, Orthodox Jews, Generation Xers, bikers. These would be considered groups under the subculture heading. Whereas an alternative group, which would be known as a counterculture, this is groups that strongly reject the dominant culture, societal views and norms, and seek alternative lifestyles. So the beatniks of the 50s, the hippies of the 60s, neo-Nazi skinheads, even the Al-Qaeda groups would be examples of counterculture. Now, to carry on the theme of some terms, when looking at culture and cultural shifts and changes, we'll begin with culture shock. This is the disorientation that people feel when they encounter cultures radically different from their own. When people travel to other societies, they may not know how to respond to that setting. And you may have had this experience yourself when you've traveled, where you've gone and you've tried to sort of get along with the culture, but found that sometimes it was difficult to figure out, or if you certainly if you didn't do any research in advance, that you may not have fit in very well because you didn't understand what was expected. And you see that, of course, happening in Canada when immigrants come to Canada, learning what it is to get used to what it is to be in Canada. Ethnocentrism. Now, this is a term that's used as a tendency to regard one own culture or group as being the standard and therefore superior, whereas all other groups are inferior. And this is based on the assumption that our own way of life is superior to all others. Now, certainly within cultural diversity, that becomes a huge problem. To judge all other cultures as inferior to our own is to say that our standard is the only standard or the best standard. And now there is a place where ethnocentrism is positive, and that's where we know if you're at your school and you sing the school song, or you pledge to the flag, or you cheer on your team, that's considered a positive ethnocentrism, where it's not something that's going to have a real negative effect on anybody. But the negative is the continued thinking that your group is superior to all other groups, and that's where we start with discrimination and stereotyping. Now, an alternative term that's often used, that's a good way to understand where your sociological imagination needs to creep in, is what's known as cultural relativity. And this is where behaviors and customs of any culture, they must be viewed and analyzed by that culture's own standard, not through our own eyes. This will help us to get beyond the ethnocentric views of cultures and looking beyond that by sort of viewing them by the standards that they exist in their own cultures. Although all sociologists share similar purpose, they typically see culture through somewhat different lenses because they are guided by different theoretical perspectives in their research. Functional analysis of culture assumes that common language and shared values help produce consensus and harmony. It's kind of like the glue. Values and norms are the glue that holds society together. Malinowski looks at culture's functions to meet people's particular needs, and he looked at there being three: the biological or physical needs for food and procreation. And then secondly, he looked at the instrumental needs. These are the laws and education which hold people together. And then there's the integrative needs, which are religion and art and other creative elements. The popular culture may help integrate people. Regardless of race, class, age, sex, or other characteristic, many people are brought together, at least in spirit, to cheer teams competitively that are competing in minor sporting events such as the Grey Cup, in the Olympic Games. Television and the internet help to integrate recent immigrants into the mainstream culture, whereas longer-term residents may become more homogenized as a result of seeing the same images and being exposed to the same beliefs and values over time. So yet many dysfunctions are still present in society. And the functionalists view this discord, things like violence in the media and the like, may promote antisocial behavior, and that's part of how they view the society. According to some conflict theorists, culture may be used by certain groups to maintain their privilege and exclude others from society's benefits. Now, the early thinkers of conflict theorists, Karl Marx, stressed that ideas are cultural creations of society's most powerful members. Thus, it is possible for political, economic, and social leaders to use ideology and integrated system ideas that is external to and coercive of people to maintain their position of dominance in society. Many of the more contemporary conflict theorists agree with Marx's assertion that ideas, the non-material component of culture, are used by agents of the ruling class to affect the thoughts and the actions of members of other classes, creating a consistent and continuous struggle for resources. Now, in addition, the access of resources, the one group keeping the ideologies focused in a manner that some people are more advantaged than other people, and continuing this consistent struggle for resources. Now, one of the bigger players in this and more contemporary thinking are the use of mass media conglomerates. Now, what you're seeing here are the top 10 corporations in the world. And you're seeing a few of them here, and all the companies in which they own. Now, groups such as AOL, Time Warner, and Disney, and Viacom, they create popular culture such as films and shows and amusement parks. And these basically are aimed at, and we'll see this in the postmodern in a way, creating a false sense of reality about what is desirable, and this sort of notion that, you know, you don't have to worry, everything's being taken care of in these little fantasy circumstances, in the way that movies, you know, produce all sorts of examples of simulation and lack of, you know, real reality. Now, in the top 10 corporations, where you see P&G and you see Kraft and Unilever, they can and do influence our shopping about what is desirable, what is fashionable, but it's got an interesting flair to it, and I'm going to show you something. What you're seeing here is Unilever's website. Now, it seems pretty plain and benign. However, what's interesting about it, if you scroll down and look at all their products, and you'll find that some of these products, you may not, have known it's owned by one company, but they are also competitors to one another. But there's also another interesting point. You see that they own Axe and Dove. Now, what's interesting about that is, if you didn't know they were owned by the same company, the Dove campaigns on beauty and treating women with respect and treating women in a way that they deserve to be treated seems to be in counter to Axe, where their commercials have long time been involved around women responding to very basal expectations about who they are and who men are, and chasing after men like they don't have a mind of their own and they don't have an ability to think on their own. Seems to be very contradictory, and yet it's owned by the same company. Now, if you don't know that, you might find yourself supporting one or the other products, thinking that that company is a really good company, and it might very well be, but it's also owned by the same. And this is where the point around conflict theory is, you know, that you don't have this information. You don't have this awareness, and therefore you're still supporting them without being aware that they have very contradictory points of view, where really all they're after is your support, your interest, your money, and it keeps the pull in one direction over another in terms of the struggle for resources. Now, these groups, they function to promote the increased consumption of commodities, and people come to believe that they need these commodities. When we look at symbolic interactionalists, they suggest that people create, maintain, and modify culture as they go about their everyday activities. So from this perspective, symbols make communication with others possible because, well, they provide people with shared meanings, and people create, maintain, and modify culture as they go about their everyday activities. If you will, people negotiate their social realities. Now, values and norms are not independent realities that automatically determine their behavior. Rather, we tend to reinterpret them with each situation we encounter. Now, this approach highlights how people maintain and change their culture throughout their interaction with others. So even if you look within your own lifetime, you know, how you celebrated Christmas with your family and how you were raised might not be the same as somebody else, but when you marry somebody, you find a way to blend your traditions, if you will. And that's where they would argue, you know, that culture can shift within our daily activities. Now, for example, if I raised my hand out to say, hey, how you doing? I put my hand out, and in your response was to step on my foot, I probably would start to reevaluate my gesture and the meaning of my gesture and my future actions over time. So our day-to-day activities can affect the way that our culture gets shifted and our perception about that culture. Now, the postmodern thinkers, They believe that there are many cultures in Canada alone, and believe that they need a new way to conceptualize culture and society. So key to the theory is that there's an Eurocentric lens. What that really means is that culture in Canada is more based on what goes on in Europe. And so this Eurocentric lens conditions our views of all cultures, and that culture of our age produces a social world that's not really real. In fact, they would argue it's more simulated. And they think that instead of speaking about culture, you need to speak about cultures, multiple. Beaubriol, his insights into postmodern was saying that a significant exposure to media produces in us a sort of a false sense of social reality. We start to, you probably have heard of the number of fake news articles that were posted in Facebook, and what role do larger conglomerates, even nations, have in what people get exposed to. So this is part of what postmodernists view as this false sense of social reality. We don't know how to critically think about what we see and what might be real and what might be false, and creating this sort of social reality that may not be accurate. It was this media creates in us this hyper reality that we must have all this information all immediately, and that we can somehow imagine ourselves developing it and creating it. There's an empirical example at the Disney theme parks, for example. We become survivors over major obstacles. We have the appearance of power, but we have none. We live just for moments without fear of crime or violence in these parks. So it's a false sense of reality, and then people, get exposed to what would be considered multiple cultures within the course of a single week. So what would the future be in relative to culture? Well, as we look forward, toward the future, both diversity and technology are likely to continue to shape culture and even culture on a global patterns, reinforcing the value of keeping our sociological imaginations actively engaged. Some of the predictions, well, one of the predictions will be that cultural diversity is going to continue to grow. Technology, well, things like television, radio, videos, electronic communications, computers, and cyberspace will all have continued and profound effects on culture. Now, do we have cultural freedom? Well, it's hard to say. We might, but then some people in the world may not have the same access to cultural freedom, as that some of their concerns are more to do with basic subsistence. I hope this has been helpful, and look forward to seeing you next week. Carry on the good fight. Bye now.